Welcome every one of you all for coming. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming.
It's a blast to see familiar faces and just a lot of faces in standing room.
I didn't know you had so many friends.
It's not friends. I wish y'all are all extras. I told them you're $10
right.
bucks ahead.
That's right. We're in LA.
Make you feel important. No, we actually was. It was so. This has been the fastest response rate of RSVPs to fill the rooms, as you all can see. It is at max capacity, fastest one that we've done. So there appears to be quite the interest in what you have to say, Mike.
Cool.
Well, let's give, Mike is literally down here. Yes. Quite the build-up. Hopefully we deliver. And Mike came down from SF just for this. So yes, big round of applause. He's coming down.
Well, and to get a sip of that new Magic Mind carbonated drink you got.
That's right. Yeah, we do have. I gave him a sip of the sparkling Magic Mind that won't hit the shelves until middle of next year. But he is the first backer of Magic Mind as well, which is the biggest claim to fame for it. Now, all right. So I'll jump into the rap sheet, and then we'll get right into the questions with Mike, who is a walking encyclopedia of insights within the startup realm. But first off, I am James, co-founder of Magic Mind, and I also office here in Neue House, and I have known Mike for probably 10 years now, 9 or 10 years.
That's about right, yeah.
And when I was starting Magic Mind, actually before starting Magic Mind, I was 2 days away from leaving Airbnb, where we had sold our last business. And Mike said, can I write you a check for your next business? And I was like, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's going to be. But secretly, I kind of had an idea. And he kept texting me, kept following up. And I almost get emotional talking about this because it's so, out of everything in the rap sheet that I will mention, that you can find out about LinkedIn, find out about you on LinkedIn or online. This is perhaps the most profound interaction I've had in business. And so he kept asking to invest, and he was texting me. He had my cell phone number. He's asking to invest, and I was like, I don't know what the idea is going to be. He's like, just please let me write a check into your next business. And I then eventually said yes, and it was because when we had sold our last business, when I sold it to Airbnb, and it sounds way cooler than it was. It was actually more like a fire sale. And we had failed to build out our vision, and truly felt like failures for this massive. 2 years into that company, in my 20s, 2 years in, we were valued at $400 million, this big high-flying company, and we would end up selling 4 years later for a fraction of that in a fire sale that we're lucky enough to convince Airbnb to buy part of the company and find seats for our team members, and felt awful. And felt like we had really failed a lot of people. We didn't return all the capital to investors, these people that they were heroes. And Mike, who wasn't an investor in ours because you're an investor in something competitive, he wrote me a note on the day that the news came out, and it was just very clear we did not achieve our goals. And there was a couple articles just dragging us through the mud. And he wrote me a note and said, James, in the moment that I met you about a year ago, I could tell there's greatness inside of you. And like I said, I almost get emotional thinking about this because he wasn't even an investor. I knew him moderately well, but he took the time in the lowest moment of a stressful 6-year just traversal in every sense, took a moment to write me that note. That probably was BS, but he knew that because
and I remember using a little bit of colorful language in the note too, like saying these reporters don't know what the fuck they're talking about. This is bullshit. Yes. You'll be back on top someday. Don't pay any attention to those numbskulls. Yeah,
that's right. There was a little bit of extra color to give a stiff arm to the chorus we were hearing from the world, and quite the contrasting voice in that one line to us.
And so far so good.
Well, I can't thank you enough for that that interaction, because whether it was just to cheer me up or not, that one line, that propelled me for years. And it still does in so many ways, but certainly in the trying times, one line from someone that knows what they're talking about and cares can mean the world to you. So I'm going to mention that right off the bat to top off the rap
That's
sheet.
pretty nice intro. Thanks.
Well, there's way more. Mike is also 8-time Midas List nominee, winner, and of the last 10 years. So basically every year he is picked as one of the best investors in the world. He's the OG of seed investing. He basically created the whole category of seed investing. So before investing in a company at a typical moment like a Series A or Series B, he was backing companies way before there was traction, way before people even knew what the founders might not even know what they were building. He started that movement of seed investing, was first investor in Twitter, Twitch, Lyft, Okta, a bunch of amazing companies. And over the last 20 years has made a name within Silicon Valley and the wider world as the best seed investor in the world. So with all of that preamble out of the way, I'm really excited to have Mike here for all of that wealth of wisdom, but also for his new book, Pattern Breakers, which is out now, that is a deep dive into what makes great founders. Cultivating that within ourselves, how to find it with a team that you might want to join. But the encyclopedia is not just a cool history, but it also is extremely precise in outlining what makes for great founders and founding teams.
Cool.
If you're down with it,
Let's do it.
I will jump into some of the questions that I have for you.
Yeah, and can I just, so in this group of people, how many of you are founders? How many are thinking about starting a startup? How many are investors, VCs, angel investors? Okay, so kind of an even mix. Okay, that's good. Okay, thanks.
And for listeners in the podcast, because we're also recording this for podcast, it was basically everyone in the room is in one of those camps, and it was about maybe 50% founders. Could we start with a little bit of your background before we jump into Pattern Breakers,
Yep.
of just how you even scratched the surface and started to create this category of seed investing, and what took you to that claim to fame?
Well, it's like a lot of things. It is kind of an accident. So I'd been a startup founder. So I was involved with 2 startups down in Austin that did pretty well. Both of them went public, and the first was a company called Tivoli Systems that went public. It was acquired by IBM. And the next was one called Motive that went public and was acquired by Alcatel-Lucent. And this was happening around 2004. And I could see that it was kind of time to get the party started again with the internet. You know, there'd been the dot-com meltdown, and things were starting to kind of regather. And there was this movement.
What gave you a sense for it was starting to
You could just kind of tell, you know, I would go to the O'Reilly Emerging Tech Conference or the Web 2.0 Summit and stuff, and, you know, you'd be hanging around with people. And what was starting to happen was that it was becoming not just a web of interconnected pages, which was kind of Web 1.0, but Web 2.0 was starting to connect people in new ways and used RESTful APIs. And, you know, you could just tell something was brewing. And it was all happening at the time in San Francisco. And so I was like, I just got to get to San Francisco. So my kiddos were in grade school at the time. So I would fly up every Sunday night and stay in Silicon Valley till Thursday and then fly back and just parachute in and try to find something exciting in Silicon Valley. And
what exactly like, can you walk me through what the day or the week would be like in terms of parachuting?
I'd just go to South Park in San Francisco and go to the cafes and meet with people, or just reach out to people I knew. And what started to happen was now I understand it to be lean startups and all that stuff. We didn't have words to describe social graphs or lean startups or any of that stuff. But what was happening was I was getting pitched by founders who only wanted to raise $1 million. And this will sound kind of crazy now, but you couldn't raise $1 million in Silicon Valley in 2005, right? You had to raise $250,000 that you scared up from friends and dentists and stuff like that, or you went straight to a $5 million Series A. And at the same time, there was this thing called the LAMP stack, where you had open source software and, you know, broadband connectivity. And so, you know, my saying was that 500,000 is the new 5 million. And so, you know, when Kevin Rose pitched me Dig, I was like, okay, what do you want to raise this money for? Do you need it for marketing or what? He said, oh no, I don't want, the last thing I want is marketing because my servers are melting down, right? Like I just need $1 million to just buy servers. And so I was like, okay, I'll be right back. I went to my car and got a checkbook and I was like, okay, where do I write it out to Dig Inc? You know, like
really $1 million check?
I didn't, well, he said, hey, not so fast, big fella. I don't know much about you yet. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do. But so my first 2 investments, you know, I think the secret to succeeding in venture is to get lucky in your first 5 years. And so my first investment that I ever made was in Evan Williams of Odeo, which ended up pivoting into Twitter. And then my second investment was in Kevin Rose of Dig. And so, you know, I was off to a pretty good start. And you know, it's easy to think you knew stuff that you didn't really know at the time, or you could kind of misremember how it really happened. And sometimes you just get lucky. And it's kind of like, what are you going to do about the fact that you got lucky?
Did you know right off the bat that you had gotten lucky, or?
Oh no, not at all. So the week after I funded Odeo, which was a podcasting company, Apple decides to give podcasting away on iTunes. And this is before the iPhone. And so 100% for all practical purposes of the playback devices were Apple. So it's like Apple's giving podcasting away for their own iPods. Like it's over, right? Like there's just no way you can make a business out of that. So, you know, so here I was 3 months into Silicon Valley, and the first investment I made is clearly, you know, a lot of people were saying, hey, I'm not really sure you're cut out to be an investor in the first place. You know, it's really different being a VC than an entrepreneur. Why don't you just be an entrepreneur? That's what you are. And so, you know, like people who give me advice are like, you know, has it ever occurred to you? You just don't know what the hell you're doing. And I was like, blasphemy. You know, you don't know what you're talking about.
Even in the midst of it being obvious that Odeo's first formation wasn't the right one, were you like, shit, I think maybe they're right? Or were you like, no,
Oh yeah. I mean, a lot of them were going bad at first. You know, Chegg, before we pivoted to textbook rentals, it was so. You know, I raised a little bit of money after Dig started working, and my first investment in Fund 1 was this textbook rental company called Chegg. But it started out as Craigslist for colleges, and Facebook decides to compete with us 3 months before we're supposed to raise the next round. And so we're like, okay, we're out of business, right? Because if Facebook succeeds, we're out of business. If they fail, we're out of business, because why are we going to succeed if Facebook can't succeed at it? And why is any investor going to be stupid enough to give us money, right? Yeah. So we're like, okay, I guess we have no better options, so let's try this textbook rental idea that we had on the side that we can't afford to do. So we put up but I'm thinking I've just invested $500,000 in my first investment, Fund 1, and it's about to go to zero within 9 months. And like, I'm going to look like just a complete loser. Yeah.
Well, a nice dichotomy to this conversation can be patterns and then pattern breaking to tee up for the book. But in terms of patterns, is that a pattern that sounds like it happened early in your career? Is that a pattern you've seen over and over again, where the first 6 months, 9 months, 2 years might be vastly different than how the story ends?
Yeah, I guess the way I think about it is one of the things I don't always like about business, or at least case studies and business theory, is that I think people explain it like it's too neat. And like in my experience of startups is that they're just freaking wild. And like, you know, but for a gust of wind, it could go your way or not your way. And when you're in the fog of uncertainty and it's crazy and everybody's arguing, should we go right or should we go left? And it's not really clear which way you should go. It's not clear. Like there are so many times along the way, right? With Twitter, they couldn't keep the site running. They couldn't decide who the CEO should be. You know, I was like, man, if somebody would give me even my money back, I might take it, right?
That's
going.
One of the most powerful things that you have ever said to me in our years of conversations. There's a few things, and I'll weave them into our conversation to make sure that I highlight these knowledge bombs. But one of them was when you said to me, you said, 2 years into Twitter, if I could have had my money back, I would have taken it.
I think I probably would have, yeah.
And why that kind of blew me away, that you know, just a first blush of that kind of statement, but also how wildly wrong things can go. and how big of a mistake, kind of the second order insight there is like, don't bail.
Thank God it's hard to sell when you're a VC.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that ends up being a feature, not a bug, because like you can't sell when you want to, and then it goes up 100x, and you're like, thank God I didn't sell. But you didn't have the chance to, along the way.
That's not the case for founders. Founders so often can be 14 months in, it's not working, I'm going to bail. And you never get to hear these stories of Twitter because it's so rare to get the long form story of anything. But two, every other investor that's not as humble and honest as you loves to tell stories of like, an early investor in Twitter, and the team was just so amazing, the collective IQ. And you were like, even in the midst of it being Twitter, after the Odeo switch and pivot, even in the midst of it being Twitter, you're like, 2 years in, I would have taken my money back, which really was like, you never hear investors talk that way.
Yeah, and it's funny because, and so like, I'm not trying to get rich selling books, but like the reason I wrote the book was that I found that there's like the entrepreneurs that I met, two things would often happen that bummed me out, because you work with founders, they become your peeps, right? And you really do want what's best for them. The first thing that would happen is they'd get stuck into a slog. They'd be 3 years into a startup, and now they wish they hadn't done it. Knowing what they know now, they wouldn't have done it. But now they're pursuing it not out of passion, but out of obligation, right? They've got employees, they've got investors. Now they didn't realize how irreversibly committed they got themselves until they realize. And to me, like if when we decided to work on Magic Mind together, you probably remember I was like, hey, look, what's an amount of money that if we raise it, it's just no harm, no foul, because we don't really know what we have here. We don't know if this is a good idea. You don't know if it's worth pursuing. I don't either. Let's just see. And if it's like we're 9 months in and you don't think it's going to work, no harm, no foul. We get our time back. So for me, that's not failure, because risk is not about avoiding failure. Risk is something you take, right? You take a risk to seize an underpriced different future, right? And so the only way to fail as an entrepreneur is to lose your time, because you'll never get your time back. And so the first thing I wanted to help founders do is eliminate ideas that sounded plausibly good but that weren't that good, because there are a lot of I'll give you an example of one, fan base. So Sarah Leary and Nirav Tolia, who started Nextdoor, great founders, started this company called Fanbase, social network for sports fans. Most dangerous idea you could have, because everybody you talk to about it says, I could see that working. Fans, sports fans, lots of them, social, hot. What's not to like? You guys are great founders. This is going to be great. But the problem was there were no desperate customers for that. And a startup with 0 desperate customers fails. And so, because product market fit answers a very specific question, what can we uniquely offer that people are desperate for? And so that is an example of a scary idea, because it sounds plausibly good, and you'll get feedback from conventional minded people that it's a good idea. And too many founders end up pursuing those kinds of ideas. But then there's the other idea, which is, it sounds stupid and it's good, right? Like Air Bed and Breakfast sounded crazy, right? You're like, I'm afraid somebody's going to get murdered in one of these things, right? Or like Lyft, like who's going to get in a stranger's car? That's crazy. Justin TV was one of the worst ideas I've ever seen, right? But thank God I still wrote a check anyway. But like, but there are
Justin TV became Twitch.
Yeah, it became Twitch. So like there are the other side of it is that startups are wild, because startup capitalism is a different kind of capitalism, and so there has to be something about it that rubs the world the wrong way, right?
Can you elaborate on that?
So like most businesses are like normal corporations, right? So like if Warren Buffett was here, he'd say that a business is valuable if it has a set of competitive advantages and a moat, and it persistently compounds those advantages over time. But you'll notice all those things I just said, a startup does none of those things. Startup doesn't have a moat. Startup doesn't have any advantages. Startup's got nothing. And so what does a startup have? It has the ability to change the subject. So a corporate capitalism creates value through persistent compounding, and having competitive advantages and moats. A startup capitalist creates value by changing the subject. So startup capitalists that win, that have these breakthroughs, they refuse the premise of the rules for how they are. And so, fundamentally, a great breakthrough startup is a provocative, disagreeable act. It's an optimistic conspiracy theory, right, to change the future. And that's going to make some people uncomfortable if it's sufficiently disruptive,
so
right?
An example would be you have all the medallions for the Cavs in New York. You're going to get more. You got the relationships, expand that competitive advantage, that moat. You have regulatory moats on your side, and then Lyft comes along and is like, oh, just get in a stranger's car, medallion or no medallion.
Right.
Just get in someone's car and trust 78 5-star reviews.
Well, and not only that, they have to launch an illegal service, right? Because if you go to the government of San Francisco and say, hey, can I launch this thing? Of course they're going to say no. And now when you're talking to the government, they've got to take something away from their citizens. But there's no way to negotiate with the CPUC of San Francisco if you just say, hey, I got this great idea. I know it's illegal. Can we change the law? Of course they won't do that, right? So you got to decide, what do you care more about? Fitting in with the conventional rules, the conventional way, or fulfilling the mission of your idea. Mm-hmm. And so almost all the great startup founders that I've worked with, they not only think differently and have these radically different ideas. So what's important about the idea to me is you want to avoid the comparison game. So earlier I mentioned desperation. If a customer has an alternative to buying from the startup, they won't buy from the startup because the startup's 80% likely to go out of business. So the only reason I'm going to buy from a startup is if I'm desperate for the empowerment that it offers me, and there's no other way I can get it. And so that's why we want desperation, because they need to feel like, I want that, there's no other way for me to get that, which means that the startup can't be compared with anything else. It can't be reconciled. So startups fail when they have to play the comparison game, and they win when they force a choice and not a comparison. So if everybody's selling apples, I don't want to be a 10 times better apple. I want to be the world's first banana. And I want to say, you may not like bananas, in which case I'm not going to waste my time with you. I'm going to go find everybody in the world who values the banana's advantage and sell to them and only them, and not waste a single erg of energy on anybody else. My favorite recent example is the Tesla Cybertruck. So I don't know, what do you think of the Cybertruck?
Cool. I'll be honest, I see clips every once in a while of leaks and things like that, quality control issues, but I did, when I saw it, did the $150 reservation for it.
You did? Okay. So how many people would want a Cybertruck, and how many people think it's kind of ridiculous? Okay, so we got
I'll add myself in there outside of the quality control.
I have to confess,
cool.
so I think it's cool, but I will confess, when I first saw it launched at that event, I thought he was joking, right? I thought, there's no way he's going to ship a truck that looks like that. You have to be kidding me. But and so you might love the Cybertruck. You might think it's ridiculous. But one thing nobody does is say, how does that compare to a Ford F-150, right?
Dude, and that's actually, to your point, I immediately reserved one just because I loved it.
So
I was like, holy shit. And
So Elon gets this, right? Elon says, live in my future or don't. But there is no reconciling the two, right? And that's why Lyft won. When you got your first Lyft ride, nobody ever said, whoa, so how does that compare to taxis? It was just instantly evident why it was better. Just people instantly gravitated to the idea. And so that's what with the pattern breaking ideas, we want something that forces a choice and not a comparison, avoids the comparison trap. And then what we want with the pattern breaking founders is pattern breaking behaviors that escape the conformity trap. And the present will fight back, and it won't fight back fair, and it will use your desire to fit in within conventional ways of fitting in to distract you from pursuing the mission with the intensity you need to pursue it to win. And so the founder has to decide, am I willing to be disagreeable enough to fulfill the mission at the expense of all, and in the early days, they engage in dirty tricks, they try to outlaw you, whatever. But then after you succeed, you have this other problem of everybody says, you're too powerful, you don't deserve it, you had to cheat to get this, you're bad guys, so you become the the powerful, greedy capitalist who cheated to get there. And so, and in many ways, the founders I work with struggle with that phase more than in the early phase. They're like, well, I'm just going to prove the world wrong. Just watch me. But now they've succeeded, and they're like, they're crapping on my life's work. I worked my ass off. Like, I'm trying to bring good to this world, and that reporter in the press or that government official or that lobbyist or whatever is shitting on my idea, and that isn't fair. They're not acting in good faith. They're not being honest, and of course they're not acting in good faith. Right. You can't negotiate with the present when you're doing a disruptive startup.
I want to talk about the inner side, navigating the inner side of building a company, because that is, as we've chatted about so many times, that's 95% of the equation, is breaking the patterns of what you might have normally done in a previous life, because now you're building a startup and it's a different paradigm, or how others might approach heavy criticism. But just to continue on the topic we were just touching on, where you basically said, around a good idea, if everybody agrees it's good. It reminds me of this quote I remember hearing of, great companies are undone by 100 good decisions. That great company gets completely destroyed by, hey, we're going to move customer support to XYZ, and it's going to be lower quality, but we're going to save some pennies here. We're going to degrade this part of the service. And they seem on a spreadsheet and a slide deck like good decisions, but they're not great decisions. In investing, could you walk me through some good decisions, but then walk me through the contrast to great decisions, and even more detail on kind of that area code you were just touching on of a good decision and be like, oh, it sounds like that should exist, fan base, versus a great decision of Airbnb breakfast, Airbnb, or Lyft?
Yeah, so I guess the way I internalize the answer to that is, business is never a fair fight. And so the only question is, who's going to fight unfair? And if the default assumption is that the present fights unfair. The incumbents fight unfair because they have the advantage of the incumbency. So like what I believe is that a startup has to decide, do I want to fight unfair? And if so, how do I do that? And I believe that there are, just like there are competitive advantages that sustainable companies harness, I believe that there are weapons that the founders harness to create these pattern-breaking ideas to not fight fair. And I think that the first is to harness inflections. And we could get into more detail on some of these.
Please, would you mind going through them?
Yeah, so an inflection, why don't we just continue on the example of Lyft, right? So an inflection is a change event that happens outside of the startup. It's a new thing that provides a new type of empowerment for specific people. So the inflection that enabled Lyft was the iPhone 4S, because it shipped with a GPS locator chip. So some of you, I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of the notion of the why now with a startup. This is the thing that vexed me for so long. The inflection helps hone in on the why now, because before the iPhone 4S, you could have had the idea for ride sharing, but it wouldn't have mattered, right? Because you couldn't have implemented a system that would have embodied the capabilities that you needed to deliver the service well enough. You wouldn't have been able to locate the riders and the drivers well enough. But the day after that iPhone 4S shipped, all of a sudden, for the first time, there was a turning point in the technology's capacity to create radical change. Now, all of a sudden, you could locate people with an algorithm within 1 meter accuracy. So that was the inflection. So inflection is always
completely outside of the company's control.
Completely outside of the, and the reason I say it's not a trend, it's not a curve, it's an inflection in the sense, just like in math, it's like a turning point on a curve. An inflection represents a turning point where what's possible today wasn't possible yesterday for the first time. And so what we want to know with an inflection is, what's the new thing? What is the empowerment that it provides, and who benefits from that empowerment? And under what conditions will that empowerment be realized? And then the next thing we care about is the insight. And so Lyft's insight was, oh, that means you could do Airbnb for cars. now that you can locate people within 1 meter with an algorithm, you can treat riders and drivers the same way you would treat guests and hosts with Airbnb. And so now that does come from the creativity of the founders, right? That is the breakthrough. And so an insight has a couple of attributes to it. One is it harnesses inflections. And the reason that's important is it has to be a powerful insight. It can't just be an insight, right? It's got to be powerful.
For those that might not know, Lyft launching peer ride sharing is very different than Uber's black car at the time. Uber then copied them, and that's the Uber we all kind of know today. But Lyft was just anyone. Doesn't have to be a black car driver. Doesn't have to be a professional driver whatsoever. It can be anyone can now.
And that was the part that was, so you want to harness inflections. You want to provide radical forms of new empowerment. And then the other thing that's subtle is you want to be non-consensus and right. And it gets to a question you alluded to a little bit ago, which is when you think about it, if you have a truly breakthrough idea, human beings are conditioned to like things. And so if everybody likes your idea, that means it's too much like what they already know, right? So what you want is an idea that a lot of people, maybe even most people, dislike at first, but a few people are like, oh my God, I can't unsee that. Where have you been all my life? And I call those people your co-conspirators. So like it's not, you don't go to market, like normal companies go to market, they say there's a bunch of customers, I've got a bunch of programs, there's a funnel, I'm gonna try to make the leads go through the funnel. In my opinion, a startup with a great insight needs to find the subset of people in the world who believe what they believe. But those customers aren't animated by utility or by reason. They buy from the startup for aesthetic reasons, right? They buy from the startup because they're irresistibly drawn to that different future that the founder puts in front of them that they can't unsee. Like, you know, you look at, like we were talking about the Cybertruck, the original Tesla Roadster would have never survived a normal comparison with a Porsche 911, right? The seat wasn't as comfortable, the radio wasn't any good, the air conditioner, I don't even know if it had an air conditioner. But by no normal standards of luxury cars would a Tesla Roadster have been considered good. But the people who bought the Tesla Roadster didn't buy it because they thought it was better at the things that Porsche owners cared about. They bought it because they believed in Elon's aesthetic vision of a world of sustainable energy. That's why they bought it. So, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about all these little decisions. I call it the curse of too many benefits. Like most of the great startups that I've seen, there's only one reason the customer really buys. And the failure mode is to not lean aggressively enough into your insight and to try to satisfy the objections of too many people with too many features, right? Like, so I think you want to find the one thing.
Good decisions that destroy your company.
So
great decisions of we're going to fire 75% of our customers over here because this is the thing.
That's right. Because it's like usually you have a fundamental insight about the future, and there's a subset of people ready to move to that different future with you. And those people need to know exactly why they need to move, right? They need a very clear call to action. And so ironically, more than one benefit is bad because it confuses them. It confuses the discussion because they don't know which benefit to pay attention to. And so what we want to do is we want to pick the benefit that's going to be most likely to emote them to want to move aesthetically to that different future, and then and lean as heavily and aggressively as we can into that. Because as a startup, we don't have much resources or time. If we have to out-execute companies, we never have a chance to win because we just don't have any people, right? We don't have any money. We don't have any reputation. And so the thing that we deliver has to offer an awesome sense of empowerment to somebody that only they can get from us.
There seems to be, and to recap that.
Am I making any sense so far?
It is, and I want to recap that because I think it's those three things they need to be underscored. That it's first is the inflection point. Might be out of your control, and this might just be you joining a company, it might be you supporting a significant other's company, or the startup that they just joined. But this inflection point for a company that becomes a pattern-breaking, massive, or just not even massive, successful startup. That's massive in its own right. A successful company, it requires something maybe outside of it that just happens to. And by the way, that the notion of why now, for every slide deck, that a business creates, or it could be you're in business development trying to sell to a corporate customer, having a why us, why this, and why now. That's what Mike is touching on. Those are the hallmarks of an amazing deck. To raise $2 million in a seed round, or to close a customer for $10,000 is why this, why us, why this team, why this product, and then why now. Why wasn't this possible before? Why should I pay attention? And this why now being tied in the inflection point, that's something that timing is everything kind of seems to suggest. And then you mentioned the second one was around
the insights.
The earned insights that you famously talk about. What's the earned insight that you have that others don't have? Sometimes it's like Lyft through building Zimride and trying to build a ride sharing service in Zimride. They kind of rode right into an inflection point, changed their model.
By the way, and I love this. So like this is, you're about to get into a super important point that we can't lose sight of, which is the implementation of the idea matters less than the insight at first. And so why is it that 80% of our exit profits have come from pivots? It's because when you have an insight, you have a first mover advantage into the future. And so even your product idea is a reference implementation of your insight. And so if you have a first mover advantage into the future and your insight's valid and customers aren't buying, one of two things is true. Well, one of three things is true. You have the wrong insight, which means you should just stop, because then there's just no point to continuing. But let's say you believe you have the right insight still. You can do one of two things. You can say, I'm talking to the wrong people. My implementation's good, but I'm talking to the wrong people. Or you can say, my implementation is bad, I'm talking to the right people. So like an example of this would be Okta, who now does cloud identity management. They started out with a problem resolution idea, talking to early adopter cloud customers, and they all were like, meh, it's cool, but it's like fifth on my list. And Todd McKinnon says, what's number one on your list? They say, identity management, total pain. He says, I'll see you in 2 weeks. So comes back with identity management. They're like, that's what I'm talking about. And so that was a case where he was talking to the right people, but he had the wrong implementation of the insight.
This is so huge that it's worth, and we will publish this episode shortly online. If there are bits of this that you find fascinating, I highly, highly, highly recommend writing them down or listening to this again, because the insights that are being clocked per hour right now are so insanely high. Even just that is worth triple underscoring that you said you can have the right implementation, you're talking to the wrong people.
Yep.
Your neighbor says, that's a shit idea. Meaningless. Or you have the wrong implementation, you're talking to the right customer, and it's two insights, one conversation away from Okta building the right product.
That's right.
And surrounding yourself with, and this gets to this last point of co-conspirators, of how friggin' important that community of co-conspirators, consumers, co-founders, early team members actually is, to where you could basically shut the door on the entirety of the rest of the world.
I love this guy.
While you're in that room with the co-conspirators, because everybody else it is not only meaningless, it could actually drag you into the opposite direction.
So like pivot turns out to be a great metaphor. It's like in basketball, you hold your pivot foot fixed. Your pivot foot, when you're an entrepreneur, is your insight. So you hold it fixed, and you move your body by moving your implementation or by varying your audience. And product market fit is the art and science of navigating your insight to the truly desperate with the right implementation. And so that's how you get strong product market fit. And so like that aspect is, I found, super important, because it helps us realize a few things. Like if you have a breakthrough idea, it's going to be non-consensus. You can't know going in that it's non-consensus and right. You can only know that you're non-consensus. You have to find out that you're right by observing the opportunity in situ, because the more of a breakthrough it is, the more it hasn't happened yet. And so, but here's the thing, that opportunity is still better to pursue, because even though it's uncertain, that doesn't make it more risky. Just because you don't know how the dots are going to forward connect doesn't mean they won't. And the risk that you're pursuing, the risk that you're taking, even if it's risky, it has a higher expected value. because you're going after something that embodies a set of very powerful forces. Where now, why do inflections matter? Inflections are like the Rock and David's slingshot against Goliath, right? Inflections allow you to bend the arc of the present to a radically different future. Incumbents win when the future is a forward projection of the present, when it's a new and improved present. Startups win when the future is a radically different outcome than the present. We want to work backwards from a radically different future. How do we do that? We harness inflections to propel ourselves to a radically different future. That's how we escape, right, the gravitational pull of the present.
I want to open it up for questions from the audience here in a sec, but I want to touch on, so you mentioned inflection point, insights, and co-conspirators.
Yep.
On the co-conspirators side of things, it seems like, in general, the opposite of like truth in our lives, or the opposite of insight, it usually isn't falsehood. You're not just like walking around believing something that's false. It's usually, it seems, in my experience, 15 years of building companies, it's usually community is the opposite of insight. It's like, oh no, I want to stick with the majority, or the number of people around me seem to believe this, so this is probably true. And insights seem to be on the other side of not like false truth, because no one's walking around with false truths that they know are false truths. They're walking around with the communal wisdom says this, conventional wisdom says it must be right because the majority. And insights seem to be on your own, on the other end of the spectrum, except for your co-conspirators.
Right.
And why talking to your neighbor, or maybe even a significant other, your best friend, your parents, are meaningless and or maybe detrimental to finding the people that, man, you really think X should exist, Y should exist. And those three people at work really lit up when you mentioned it. That person at the gym, when you told them about this, when they were talking about subject X, Y, or Z, they lit up. Those are the co-conspirators along with co-founders. Yeah. Do you mind building out what to look for in this often overlooked area of co-conspirators of customers and co-founders?
So William Gibson, the cyberpunk author, was right when he said that the future is already here, it's not evenly distributed, right? So like, where do insights come from? They don't come from trying to think of a startup or by saying, I've got better binoculars and vision than the next person has. They come from directly living in the future, getting one's hands dirty with what's new about it. And it's by tinkering with what's new about this different future that causes the founder to see firsthand the different opportunities to think, feel, and act according to a new pattern. And it's by encountering the barriers to their success that they see what's missing in the future. And so, like, some people are living in the future before the rest of us are.
So I love solving a problem you yourself have, because you're like, shit, these other solutions don't work for this problem I have.
So, yeah, exactly.
I'm living in the future of
So like Mark Andreessen, right, when he was at the University of Illinois, he was in a supercomputer lab and he helps build the Mosaic browser. He didn't think about a browser market. He didn't know anything about business. He was a kid making minimum wage in a computer lab, right? Mm-hmm. He was tinkering with internet, World Wide Web technologies, which, by the way, had just been made legal for business. And he was trying to make the internet useful for him, right? And so when you are living in the future and you see what's missing in the future and you build what's missing, your intuition about what to build is far more likely to be right? Because so then the only question becomes, am I living in a valid future that a bunch of people are about to visit someday, right? So like the best founders are like time travelers. They find the future first. They figure out a hidden truth about that future, and then they come back to the present and they find early co-conspirators who are prepared to believe in the truth that they've discovered. They come back to the present, they bring those people with them to the future, and they co-create the future with their co-conspirators, right? And so they create a movement together. But like another example I like is when I was at Silicon Graphics in the early 90s, we wanted to sell to Hollywood. And so Industrial Light and Magic did all the cool special effects in movies. And so my job was to sell to ILM computers that would help them model dinosaurs in Jurassic Park or the Terminator 2 or the Abyss, or that kind of stuff. And I realized as we started to work with ILM, if we solve their problem, they're going to take us to the promised land. Like if they can use our computers to make those dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, every single post effects shop in Hollywood throughout the entire world is going to buy $10 million worth of our computers for every movie they make, because like ILM's going to have to solve a set of unsolved problems to make all this stuff work together. They're going to have to convert the computer graphics into something that they can put on top of a film, and they're going to have to digitize the film that they shoot in the background. Like that stuff that we now take for granted once wasn't there, right? It was once missing in the future. And so like that's the thing, right? Like insights come from living in the future before other people. And you get two advantages. One is you notice what's missing in the future, but the other thing is you're with like-minded co-conspirators all seeing the same thing, so you're more likely to notice it. And then you're more likely to attract believers because they believe what you believe. And so like living in the future, I think, is like the ultimate cheat code for coming up with startup ideas.
And I love 200 Investments, love finding founders that are solving their own problem, not because it's not a end-all be-all way of doing it, but they are living in that future of there is no solution for this, like the one I'm creating. They're already in the communities of other people that have that problem, so they already have those isolated, minority, because they're like, I just know this works. I don't need my parents and my roommates to tell me that it's awesome. I know that it is better than all the other solutions out there. You're almost de facto domain experts.
That's right. So like I'm sympathetic to the founders who have this happen to them, but like a lot of times what I see is what I would call a Frankendeck. And it's like what happens is they have a pitch, they go to one of their advisors, a well-meaning advisor, and they say, well, you shouldn't say you're Airbnb, you rent an extra room in somebody's house. You're a marketplace for unused residential real estate, because VCs like marketplaces. Marketplaces or network effects business. Okay, I'll add that. Oh, you haven't said anything about millennials. You haven't set the context. You need a few slides on that. You haven't created a competitive positioning slide against VRBO. And what ends up happening is the poor founder has 30 slides, all of which try to anticipate and counter every conceivable objection they've gotten that they've heard from their well-meaning advisors. And now it's like I'm the person that was prepared to believe their insight, and I never got a chance to understand what it is because they're going through the deck so fast that I just never had a chance for them to just lay it out, right? And so it's far better to say there's a set of people ready to move with me. I need to find those people and be clear as a bell with them and not worry about the inputs of anybody who's not ready to move.
Yeah, it's like they say in writing, write and the audience will gather. Instead of like, what do people want to read? Let me go try to figure out 10 out of 10 people what story they might want. And I think it's worth underscoring that you're finding, I love that you word it, desperate customers. To look for customers that light up, even with version 1 that's ugly. That's why I remember hearing this phrase of, if they'll buy it when it's ugly, they'll pay even more when it's pretty. Your first version, one of the worst things you can do is be like, oh, it's not pretty enough. I'm not going to release it, not going to release it, not going to release it. Because you never realize, maybe people aren't desperate for this.
If they don't want your minimum viable product, they're not going to want your maximum viable product, right? Yeah. Because they weren't desperate.
Well, that is awesome. Thank you, Mike. We'll open up for crowd questions. And Lucas,
and if anybody wants to call BS too, that's fine. We don't mind being challenged.
He's quite good at being challenged. And Lucas, if we have a microphone, I can repeat the question too, because it's small enough room. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Such a great talk. You talk about inflection points, and one of them that's right in front of us is AI. And the current of AI is pretty massive, and it's sweeping across the world, and it's like hitting a lot of different industries like healthcare, sales, movies, yada yada yada. How do you take that in and like decide to like as you're like kind of receiving companies, meeting new founders, taking on this challenge, and how do you kind of siphon through the noise and decipher?
Great question. I'll mention again I'll repeat it for the podcast audience. And do you mean as an investor or as a founder?
I guess either or.
Okay. So a massive inflection point that seems to be taking place is AI. And even with this rubric, Inflections, Insights, Co-Conspirators, what do you do in the midst of a massive inflection point that I think Bill Gates put it best when he said, it is bigger than the internet revolution. AI being bigger than the internet revolution, according to him. Yeah, what do you do with this as an investor or as a founder?
Okay, there's a more simple answer and a more rabbit hole answer. So we'll do the simple one and see if we have time for the rabbit hole one, depending on people's patience. But the simple thing would be, I think that AI and LLMs and what we're seeing undoubtedly provide profound forms of empowerment. That's really exciting. So I get pitched all the time by AI-powered startups, and I'm like, yep, that looks awesome. I could totally see why I would want that. I could totally see why tons of people would want this. The challenge that I've seen with the AI startups is that not as many have had a fundamental insight. And so, like a lot of the AI startups, I'm like, I can see that product working. I can see people wanting it, but I don't know why there won't be 5 just like it, or I don't know why somebody won't leapfrog it, when Sam Altman does his next demo. And so, we need to remember that it's not enough to have empowering capabilities. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to succeed, but like I'm all about fighting an unfair fight that improves your odds, right? And so I think in order to succeed with the AI opportunities, the key will be to have a non-consensus and right idea about how the inflections can be harnessed. And that's a little bit harder because people tend to jump to the, wow, this thing can generate video. So they come up with a generative video product that looks really awesome, but you're like, okay, but like, that's not going to be a mystery to people, right? And if all it's going to be is a race to who gets there first, that's a different discussion than avoiding the comparison trap and, forcing a choice and not a comparison.
There are examples of companies like Midjourney, which have made these quantum leaps of staggering innovation, and yet also seems to be completely unstable. Who knows what will happen? I think a co-founder even left and said, whoops, it's probably not going to win. And they, I don't know, 100, 200, they raised 9 digits of funding, staggering innovation, and still seems to this question where you'd say, okay, there's a non-consensus and right approach here where you don't end up on the tarmac of everyone else is doing it, or there's 5.
Yeah, most of the ideas that we've invested in that are working are ones where the founder has some mix of attributes that make them more authentic to the opportunity. So, for example, my partner Ann invested in this company called Smarter DX, and it'll take like a hospital bill that's classified in such a way that the hospital will get paid less, and it'll figure out the way it could get paid the most. And then, but like the guy that started it used to be a doctor, and you used to operate on people's hearts, right, and stuff like that. And he's got some great AI people on the team, but like somebody isn't going to just drop out of Stanford and use the latest LLM model to do that, because you got to talk to some guy that runs a hospital. And the person has to believe that you can do the job, right? And so that would be a case. And his insight was not obvious because he lived the problems that the hospitals live. Like the average person would have no context to know that that's a problem worth solving. And so a lot of insights aren't really contrarian. It's just that you encounter a secret, you earn a secret that other people don't earn because you're kind of fishing in different territory, right, than the rest of us. And so that would be, I think, an example of one that's done pretty well.
Yeah, and it kind of adds to trying to become a speed dating domain expert in a place that you don't really know it's always going to be a bit of a stretch, added risk on top of even more risk. Yes, question up there.
Hi, thank you. Amazing talk, and really happy to be here. It seems like the key to all this is getting hip to inflections, and that's looking at the future. So how can you make a DeLorean, so to speak, and actively see the future? It seems like being an insider is a big part of it, but I want to know, how can you get hip to inflections? Is the thing.
Another great question, how to get hip to inflections, because that seems to be part of
so this is the top thing I learned is that, like, we talk a lot about, when we do customer development, we talk about get out of the building, right? But what I say to people is, even before you do that, you want to get out of the present. And so, what does that mean? So like one person I work with, Maddie Hall, started this company called Living Carbon. and they make genetically modified trees that grow faster and have harder wood and take more carbon out of the atmosphere. And Maddie was a product manager at Zenefits. And so she's thinking of startup ideas and thought that they were mostly mundane. And she came to a really interesting decision, which was, I'm going to see if I can just follow Sam Altman around. So she became Sam Altman's chief of staff. And talk about a way to get out of the present, right? Like Sam Altman's meeting every day with people who live in the future. And one day she's in a meeting with Microsoft. They say, we're going to do something for real about climate change. We need to do something about carbon takeout. And she had only recently also met with some scientist who had new ideas about how genetically modified trees could take more carbon out of the atmosphere. And she's like, it comes back to that guy. Have you ever thought about starting a company? And so what she did was really clever because she found a way to catapult herself out of the present. But like I just fundamentally believe that we need to find ways to get out of the present. If we're not out of the present, we need to ourselves get out of the present or find somebody who's living in the future. But I think that the failure mode is usually, and there's no one size fits all advice, but like the thing to watch out for is trying to think of startup ideas while living in the present. Because what you'll tend to do is talk to other people living in the present, and you'll solve present pain, which means that as the entrepreneur, we've unwittingly bought into a context, which is the rules got defined by somebody else. And so we don't want to participate in markets where there's an available market. We want to define the future market by following inflections rather than analyzing existing markets.
Yeah, Brian Eno has that term he created, genius, of that there's no such thing as isolated genius just coming up with insights on their own. It's typically a network or community of people, the right type of people. Bob Dylan leaving Duluth, Minnesota, and actually going to Bleecker Street. Very different Bob Dylan, wildly different. Bob Dylan than the exact same person in a different scene. And what's so great about today, becoming hip to insights, and that to that point of community, of the right community versus maybe just the majority, is follow 5 people and 5 people only that you really think are living in the future on a social platform, and just imbibe, even if it seems so idiotic, crazy, imbibe it over time. It's the beauty of the world we live in right now. Anyone listening to this podcast episode in any far corner of the earth can do this, to where, hip to insights might be these 5 people, these 5 newsletters for 6 straight months instead of the news.
There's a term that relates to this that we haven't really talked about, but I love, which I call it founder future fit. And so, like, Justin Kahn, it turns out, was ideally suited to do Justin TV. It was a live 24/7 stream of his life. It was a terrible idea, terrible business. But like, Justin wanted to be internet famous before we had a term called influencer, right? He was building the thing, well, his team was building the thing that he wanted for himself. And so he had an authenticity to that future. If you're a 30-something-year-old person with 3 kids, you can't live stream your life 24/7. You're not going to you're not going to be intrinsically motivated to do it the way Justin was. And ironically, Justin's second startup, Atrium, didn't work out. And it was because he didn't care about law. He thought legal tech was a good idea for a startup. He was trying to think of a startup. He was more interested in being a high status founder like Brian Chesky or Patrick Collison, but he didn't have an authentic. So like, when I look at a lot of these startups, I ask myself, why is this team the most ideally matchable team to that given future that exists anywhere in the world? And that's a function of several things. What's their intrinsic motivation? Who are they as people? What do they know? Who do they know? What have they discovered? All of those things contribute to the authenticity of the founder's match to that future.
Yeah, partial information is a dangerous thing, because even in this, just talking about this, Mike is one of those people that we could all benefit from following and amplifying that voice if the startup game is of interest, and kind of, I don't know, nullifying many of the other voices, because even in this topic, in a domain that like the doctor,
right.
Could be completely the wrong move of, I want to find a startup idea,
right.
Versus I want to live in the future, or I want to surround myself in my internal dialogue around future oriented ideas within a domain I already know, orient myself around daily, and therefore those insights are going to be far more valuable to me.
And what it inexorably leads you to is you want to tinker with ideas where you're not attached to it being a startup yet. Like great ideas come from exploring the unexplored. And so you want to explore things that most people think would be a waste of time. And so you're exploring something because it's interesting for its own sake, and it's your willingness to explore the unexplored that causes you to open a fractal of new knowledge that leads to the breakthrough, right? Because all breakthroughs by definition are undiscovered. And so we have to discover the undiscovered. The only way you do that is to explore the unexplored. And so if you have to start an entire company and raise a round and hire a bunch of people to do that exploration, you're setting yourself up. It's kind of like we were talking about this earlier today. Like the great sketch artists, they start out by writing a really faint line, and they start to resolve the drawing over time. But they're not attached to the drawing being right at first. They increase their commitment to what the art looks like as they increase their certainty of what it should look like. And so the lower the cost of the bet that you can make to pursue what's interesting, the more likely you are to hit onto something, and the less likely you are to be bummed out if you don't, right? Because you're not attached to succeeding. It's kind of like little kids when they play soccer. They just kick the ball around and not overthink it.
Yeah, like that old Michelangelo wasn't, he said I wasn't creating David, I was releasing him from the stone. Releasing the idea that you yourself have already been maybe overlooking. I think that desperation point is really great, again, here in this context, because look where you already have pain. Look into the pain. Because that desperation, if you're desperate for something, there likely are 10,000, 100,000 other people desperate for something to exist, and most people want to look away from pain, but you know that the crack is where the light comes in type of thing of like, don't overlook the pain you might have right now that you're like, I wish that didn't exist, I want someone else to solve it, and maybe it's like, oh, shit, maybe I should surrender into solving this, and 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people need it as well. One more question, and Mike's got to get to the airport. Any others? All right. Yeah, we got one, yeah. High hand right there. Yeah, go for it.
Mike, thanks for coming down. I listened to you on Lenny's podcast about a month ago.
Cool.
Wonderful insights. James, thanks for moderating.
Lenny's another investor in Magic Mind. Shout out to Lenny Rachitsky, another brilliant mind you can follow. Yeah.
Awesome. Simple question for you guys. How did you decide how to get dressed for this podcast today?
Wow, cool question. The question was, for the podcast listeners, how did you decide to get dressed in what you're dressed in today? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Mike?
Oh, man. I got to admit, I got up pretty early this morning. I got up at like 4:30 because I had to catch an early flight. So I just kind of went into the closet and picked a few things out. I couldn't really see them, and I put them on, and I left the master bedroom area, and fortunately, I mean, it matched okay, I guess. So I said it's good enough.
Well,
Yeah.
can I flip it on you and ask what makes you ask that question?
Yeah, so I started Fitted. We help people get dressed every day. Exactly, Jason Calacanis, have 40,000 people on your app, 10K ARR, and I'd love to talk to you about helping other people get dressed.
That is so awesome. What's your name? Yeah, round of applause for what's your name?
Phoenix.
Phoenix?
Yeah.
Hell of a name. So Phoenix just said that he's building a startup that helps people find fitted clothes, and that as the saying goes, always be closing. There are opportunities. Talk about going against the majority.
Yeah, that was impressive shooting his shot there.
Yeah,
that's
good. And shit, that's like, if you have a pain point of I want investors for my business, and you overlook that pain point because you don't want to look in the pain.
And I might be a better investor than a customer for an idea like that, as you could clearly see. I may not be desperate for the answer to that question.
But it's so interesting that it's almost like an investor, one of the best investors in the world is here. Maybe there's 3 other people that thought about approaching Mike or asking about that. And even myself, it never occurred to me that someone would ask that. So brilliant pattern breaking, Phoenix, to even recognize like, oh, this is possible. I can ask this, make the pitch, so to speak, in the midst of the Q&A. The answer to you is I just wear the same thing every day. So.
No, we'll say one thing. Like every investor is different. The best way to pitch me is just send an email, mmjr@floodgate.com, because I'm not good at evaluating an elevator pitch. It's not how my mind, because the way my mind works is you probably have a sense of it now. It's like to say, okay, slow down. What's the inflection? Can you explain that to me? And a lot of times the entrepreneur isn't familiar with that language, right? And so you gotta give the founder some time to adjust to kind of what you're really asking. And so, like some investors can decide, like in a 30-second pitch, I can't do that. Like it's like my style of evaluation doesn't work that way.
Don't worry, it didn't happen for Calacanis either. I bamboozled him at a Q&A in San Fran, and we ended up talking for like an entire hour. So it's something I can follow up with you on.
It's a great. That is a great capstone to the evening around pattern breaking. Just even having the insight to ask that question with limited time, with an investor in mind, like Mike's here. One thing that I think is also worth underscoring, a theme that seems to come back over and over again with even just how you just answered that, how you listen. You are a freak of nature listener. Every time I'm chatting with Mike throughout the years, he is the walking encyclopedia, and yet he's always asking me questions, asking everyone you're interacting with questions. You might notice he brought a pen to the interview for him because he brought a pen because he was like, might need to jot notes down for things that we talk about. That's the sensitivity of your ears, and it sounds like it's almost the subtext to noticing that there's an inflection point requires a sensitivity of listening. Noticing in the sea of information where is an insight, just lying sometimes in plain sight, a sensitivity of listening. Finding the right audience and knowing when you're in the midst of the wrong audience for the co-conspirators is a sensitivity of listening, or even knowing how you listen of, hey, this is how I like to receive information. The sensitivity of listening seems to be a subtext superpower of pattern breakers, of founders. Does that provoke any thoughts?
I think so, because the one thing I've observed in these pattern breaking founders is most people, when they have a new idea, they seek validation. And so they have the idea, they want to get the customer to buy into their idea. And so it's almost like they want to trick them into saying yes to their idea. Or they run an experiment to validate their hypothesis, which is a fairer way of describing it. But when you think about it, if you're pursuing a breakthrough, you should want to be surprised, because breakthroughs are undiscovered. And so it's axiomatic that you should want to be surprised. And so the great breakthroughs, actually, I find, come from savoring surprises. And in order to savor a surprise, you have to seek truth more than you seek validation, right? You have to always believe that your truth as you see it is falsifiable at any time, and that there's going to be some new addition to your truth, that there's going to be something that you don't know about. And in fact, if you don't learn something you didn't know about in a meeting, you lost that time. There's an opportunity cost of your time to learn something that you didn't learn anything about. And so I think that that's right. And like a lot of people that I know and work with, I encourage them, if they do like some people journal every day, one of the entries that I encourage them to have in their journal is, what surprised me today? Because it's kind of like good to exercise that muscle every day of being surprised, because it's like they're all around us. It's just most of us don't bother to look. Most of us are too busy thinking about what the other people around us think to just pick a secret right up off the ground when it reveals itself. And so there's a lot to be said for, surprises are like something that I steal, that I just pick them up when other people don't. And so I think that that's kind of a good habit to get into. It's a good way of showing up in the world, I think, as a founder.
That's awesome. Well, speaking of showing up, thank you so much for showing up down here. Thank you, Venice. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, buddy. Good to see you. Pattern Breakers is the book, and it is out everywhere now. Thank you, Mike. Yep. And I think you mentioned it. You mentioned MM Jr. at Floodgate.
One last thing, especially to founders. We need more people who want to change the future. And so I salute you. it takes a lot of guts to stick your neck out. It's a lot easier to go with the flow. And so, Godspeed.
Amen. Thank you, Mike.